The glass didn't shatter when it hit the wall behind Dean Martin's head. It exploded. Champagne and crystal fragments rained across the stage of the Copa room while 2,000 people held their breath, and Dean Martin stood perfectly still at the microphone, his face showing nothing at all. The smell of cigarette smoke and expensive perfume hung thick in the air, mixing now with the sharp sweetness of spilled Dom Perignon. Somewhere in the third row, a man in a charcoal suit was already standing, his hand moving toward his jacket, and the pit orchestra had stopped playing 30 seconds ago. The silence that followed wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a living thing, pressing against eardrums, squeezing throats, making it impossible to swallow. Dean's fingers were still wrapped around the microphone stand, knuckles white. His eyes hadn't moved from the table near the back, where Sam Giancana sat with his arms folded, his face carved from stone, waiting. The champagne was still dripping down the velvet curtain, each drop hitting the stage floor like a ticking clock. No one was laughing. No one was applauding. No one was even shifting in their seats. The Copa room, where Sinatra had crowned himself king and where Dean Martin had built his reputation as the one man who couldn't be shaken, had become a tomb. And Dean Martin was standing in front of 2,000 witnesses with a choice that had no good answers. He could apologize. He could walk off stage. He could finish the joke he'd started, the one that had just put a glass through the air and a bullet in his future. Or he could do what he'd done his entire life, refuse to blink. But his heart was hammering so hard he could taste it, could hear it drowning out every other sound in the room. His throat had gone completely dry. Somewhere behind him, a shard of crystal hit the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. To understand why that moment mattered, you need to understand what had been building in the 4 days before that glass left Sam Giancana's table. The pressure that had been tightening around Dean Martin's throat since Monday afternoon, when the call came through to his dressing room. Not a threat, just a message. Mr. Giancana would be attending Friday's show. He was looking forward to it. He hoped Dean would make it memorable. The man who delivered the message had been polite. His voice had been soft. His eyes had been dead. Dean had sat in the silence of his dressing room for 20 minutes, staring at his reflection, and felt something old and familiar coiling in his stomach. Recognition. The recognition that comes when you realize you've walked into a situation with only 2 exits, and both of them lead somewhere you don't want to go. Because what the audience never understood was that the entire act was a negotiation with fear. Every joke, every song, every seemingly careless shrug was a calculated move in a game where the stakes were survival. And when Sam Giancana was sitting in the audience, the rules weren't just different. They were designed to ensure you lost. This wasn't going to be a show. It was going to be a demonstration, a public test of whether Dean Martin understood his place in the hierarchy of Las Vegas power. And the terrible thing about tests administered by men like Sam Giancana was that there was no way to prepare. You either passed or you disappeared. Dean Martin had been afraid before. He'd grown up in Steubenville, Ohio, where his father ran a barber shop on the wrong side of town. Dean had spent his childhood watching men with broken noses and scarred knuckles sit in the chair and discuss things in low voices while his father worked in silence, never asking questions, never making the mistake of seeming too interested in conversations that could get you killed. Dean had learned the lesson his father never spoke out loud. In the presence of dangerous men, you survive by becoming invisible. But Dean had also learned something his father hadn't intended. Invisibility was its own kind of prison. You couldn't build a career, couldn't command a stage, couldn't become Dean Martin by making yourself small every time someone dangerous walked into the room. So Dean had developed a different survival strategy. He'd built an entire persona around the appearance of not caring about success, about failure, about what anyone thought of him. He'd made indifference into armor, transformed apathy into a shield so convincing that people genuinely believed nothing could touch him. It was brilliant in its way. Because if you genuinely don't care, you can't be threatened. You can't be controlled. You can't be broken. But here was the flaw in the armor. He did care. He cared desperately. Every night he stepped on stage was laced with the terror that this would be the night everyone realized that Dean Martin, the king of cool, the man who made not caring look like the most powerful thing in the world, was actually the most terrified person in the room. Monday night's show had felt wrong from the opening number. The energy in the Copa room had been off, not hostile, not cold, just watchful. Like the audience had come to witness something instead of to be entertained. After the show, Dean had found Joey Bishop waiting in his dressing room with a bottle of scotch and an expression that said everything. Joey had poured 2 glasses without asking, had said very quietly, "He's staying on the 9th floor." Dean hadn't needed to ask who. "How long?" "As long as it takes," Joey had said. Sam Giancana was in the building. Sam Giancana was watching, and the pressure would be applied. The only question was how hard, and whether Dean would break before or after the breaking became public. Tuesday morning brought the first real escalation. A man Dean had never seen before appeared at his suite. Vincent, just Vincent. He'd explained that Mr. Giancana had some concerns about Friday's show. Nothing serious, just concerns. See, Mr. Giancana would be bringing associates, important men from Chicago who valued discretion and respect. And Mr. Giancana wanted to make sure Dean understood the kind of show these men appreciated. Family-friendly, professional, no jokes that might be misinterpreted as disrespectful, no comments that might reference anyone in particular. Dean had nodded along, his mind racing through his entire act, trying to figure out which jokes Vincent was talking about. But that was the point. They weren't telling him what not to say. They were telling him to be afraid of saying anything. Vincent had finished his coffee, stood, thanked Dean for his understanding. At the door, he paused. "Mr. Giancana's really looking forward to Friday. He'd hate for anything to spoil it." And then he'd left, and Dean had sat alone with his breakfast going cold, feeling the walls closing in. Tuesday night's show had been a disaster, not because the audience hadn't laughed, but because for the first time in 20 years, Dean Martin had censored himself on stage. He'd felt a joke rising to his lips, a good joke, a Dean Martin joke, and he'd swallowed it, moved on to something safer, something that couldn't possibly be interpreted as a veiled reference to organized crime or power or violence. And the audience had felt the shift. Dean Martin was holding back. Dean Martin was being careful. Dean Martin was afraid. After the show, Dean had locked himself in his dressing room and tried to figure out what to do. He could play it safe, could sand down every rough edge in his act, turn himself into a sanitized version that wouldn't offend anyone. It would work. Sam Giancana would leave satisfied. Dean would survive. But something would be gone, something essential. And once that thing was gone, he'd never get it back. Every mobster in every city would know that Dean Martin could be controlled. He'd spend the rest of his life performing for people who knew he'd folded when it mattered. Wednesday had been worse because nothing happened. No messages, no visits, no threats. Just silence. Dean had woken up expecting another knock, another polite conversation with another man in an expensive suit. But no one had come. The silence was more terrifying than the threats because Dean couldn't figure out what it meant. Had they decided he'd gotten the message? Had they decided the message hadn't worked? Or had they already decided what was going to happen to him and stopped bothering with warnings? Dean had performed that night in a state of suspended panic, his eyes constantly scanning the audience, searching for Sam Giancana's face. But Sam Giancana hadn't been there. The audience had been normal, giving Dean a standing ovation that should have felt like victory, but felt like a reprieve. After the show, Joey had stopped by again, had poured the scotch again, had sat in silence for 5 minutes before finally saying, "You know what they're doing, right?" Dean had known. They're letting you think about it. They're giving you time to make the right decision. And what's the right decision? Dean had asked. Joey had looked at him for a long moment. Whatever keeps you alive. Thursday morning, a phone call. A voice Dean recognized from somewhere in his past, rough and crackling with false enthusiasm. The voice had explained that he was calling on behalf of mutual friends who cared about Dean, who wanted to make sure nothing unfortunate happened to damage such a promising career. The word unfortunate had hung in the air like smoke. Dean had hung up and sat on the edge of his bed, feeling something inside him start to harden. Not anger, but the realization that this wasn't going to stop. The warnings would keep coming until Dean broke or until Friday night arrived and Dean demonstrated publicly whether he'd learned his place or needed to be taught a lesson. And in that moment, Dean Martin had made a decision. Not a brave decision, not a smart decision, but the only decision that made sense. He was going to do his act, his real act, the jokes he'd spent 20 years developing, the persona he'd built from scratch. He was going to walk on that stage Friday night and be Dean Martin, and whatever happened after that would happen. Because if he was going to die, and there was a very real possibility he was going to die, he'd rather die as himself than survive as someone else's puppet. Thursday night's show had been the calmest Dean had felt all week. He'd walked on stage knowing what he was going to do Friday, and the knowledge had settled something inside him. After the show, Dean had found an envelope on his makeup table. No name, no return address. Inside was a note. Mr. Giancana will be seated at table 7. We hope the show meets his expectations. Dean had read it 3 times, had stared at his reflection at the face that smiled for audiences, that hid fear behind indifference, and felt his hands start to tremble. They'd still been trembling when he'd fallen asleep, and they'd been trembling when he'd woken up Friday morning and realized he had 12 hours left to live. Friday arrived not like an execution date, but like a surgical procedure scheduled weeks in advance. Inevitable, methodical, precise. Dean had gone through his routine automatically: shower, shave, breakfast he couldn't taste, lunch he couldn't finish. He'd arrived at the Copa room at 7, 3 hours before showtime, and sat alone in the empty space. In 2 hours, this room would be packed, and Sam Giancana would be sitting at table 7, and Dean Martin would either prove he couldn't be controlled or prove he could be killed. There was no middle ground. Joey had found him sitting there at 8:30, had sat down next to him without a word. After 5 minutes of silence, Joey had said, "Whatever you do tonight, you're going to have to live with it for the rest of your life, however long that is, so make sure it's something you can live with." Then he'd stood up and walked away. The Copa room had been standing room only by 8:50. Dean could hear them from backstage. At 8:55, the house lights dimmed. The orchestra started the overture, and Dean Martin walked to the edge of the stage, his hands trembling, his heart hammering, and waited for his cue. The spotlight hit him at 9 exactly. The applause crashed over him, and Dean Martin stepped into the light and began to sing. For the first 30 minutes, it was perfect. The jokes landed, the song soared, the audience was electric. Dean hadn't looked at table 7, not once. He'd kept his eyes on the balcony, on the side tables, on the anonymous faces, but he'd felt Sam Giancana's presence like a weight on his chest, like a hand around his throat. Then, 33 minutes into the show, Dean had allowed himself one glance at table 7. Sam Giancana had been watching him with an expression that communicated everything. The test was still active, the verdict was still pending, and the next 5 minutes would determine everything. Dean finished the song, took a sip from his glass, let the applause die down. And in the silence that followed, Dean Martin looked directly at table 7 and made his choice. "You know," Dean said, his voice casual as if he were ordering breakfast, "some people think Las Vegas is run by shady characters." The laughter started small, uncertain, rippling through the front rows. Dean let it build, let the tension stretch. "I say that's ridiculous," Dean continued, and now his smile widened, and he raised his glass toward table 7 in a mock toast. "Some of my best friends are shady characters." The room erupted. People doubled over, someone in the balcony whistled, a woman slapped her husband's shoulder in delight. The laugh built, and Dean didn't look away from Sam Giancana's table, not for a second, and that's when Sam Giancana's hand moved, slow, deliberate, picking up his champagne glass. The laughter began to die, and Sam Giancana threw the glass. The glass exploded. The laughter died instantly. The orchestra stopped. 2,000 people froze, and Dean Martin didn't move. His hand stayed on the microphone stand. His eyes stayed on Giancana's table. His expression didn't change. The silence that followed was absolute. Dean could hear his own heartbeat, could hear someone trying to suppress a cough, could hear the air conditioning humming. 5 seconds passed. 10. 15. Long enough for everyone to imagine what could happen next. Long enough for Sam Giancana to stand. The sound of his chair scraping was like thunder. The man in the charcoal suit had his hand inside his jacket. Sam Giancana stood there, staring at Dean Martin, and in that moment, Dean Martin made the only decision that could possibly save him. He laughed, not a nervous laugh, not forced, a real laugh, genuine and warm and utterly insane. He laughed like he'd ordered that glass thrown himself as part of the act, like this whole thing was a bit they'd rehearsed, like Sam Giancana was his straight man instead of his executioner. And then he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dean said, his voice steady, despite the terror screaming through every nerve, his smile widening. "That's the toughest audience reaction I've ever gotten. Usually they just walk out." The room exploded, not with laughter, but with relief, admiration, shock. People doubled over. People wiped tears. People applauded not because the joke was funny, but because Dean Martin had just turned a death threat into a punchline and made it look effortless. And Sam Giancana, still standing, his face still unreadable, did something no one expected. He smiled, just barely, just the corners of his mouth lifting a fraction. But Dean saw it, and Sam Giancana sat back down. The orchestra started playing again. Dean finished the show. He sang 4 more songs, delivered a dozen more jokes, closed with his signature number while the audience sang along. And when he finally walked off that stage, when he made it past the curtain, his legs nearly gave out. He made it to his dressing room on muscle memory, closed the door, locked it, collapsed into the chair, and stared at his hands. They were shaking. They'd been shaking the entire time. For 90 minutes, he'd convinced 2,000 people he was fearless, and his hands had been shaking the entire time. His shirt was soaked through. He could smell his own sweat mixed with stage makeup and something else. The sharp, metallic scent of adrenaline burning off. His jaw ached from clenching it. When he tried to stand, his knees buckled, and he had to grip the edge of the makeup table to stay upright. He sat back down, stared at the light bulbs ringing the mirror, counted them, lost count, started again. The knock came 20 minutes later. Dean's body tensed. His hand moved toward the phone. But when he opened the door, it wasn't a man with dead eyes. It was Joey Bishop, holding 2 glasses of scotch, grinning like a man who just watched someone walk across a tightrope blindfolded. "You crazy son of a bitch," Joey said. Dean took the scotch, drank half of it, sat back down. Joey pulled up a chair, and for a long moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched. Joey opened his mouth twice, closed it both times. Finally, he said quietly, "He could have killed you." Dean nodded. "Yeah. So why didn't you just do the safe show?" Dean looked up, his eyes red, his hands still trembling around the glass. "Because then I'd be dead anyway." The story spread like wildfire. By Saturday morning, every performer in Las Vegas knew. By Sunday, it had reached Los Angeles. By the end of the month, it had become legend. The night Dean Martin stared down Sam Giancana and lived. But the legend got it wrong. The legend made it sound like Dean hadn't been afraid, made it sound like he'd walked onto that stage confident in his ability to charm a killer with a punchline. Dean Martin had been terrified. He'd spent 4 days drowning in fear, receiving warnings, rewriting his act, and throwing away the rewrites, convinced he was about to make the worst mistake of his life. And when the moment came, when he stood at that microphone with Sam Giancana's eyes burning into him, he hadn't stopped being afraid. He'd just decided that some things were worse than death, like living the rest of your life knowing you'd surrendered the only thing that made you yourself. Dean never talked about that night publicly, never turned it into an anecdote, never bragged about it. He just kept working, kept singing, kept walking onto stages with a drink in his hand and a smile on his face, and the quiet knowledge that he'd been tested in the only way that mattered, and he hadn't broken. Weeks later, alone in his suite at 3 a.m, Dean would stand at the window and look out at the lights of Las Vegas stretching toward the horizon. He'd think about that night, about the sound of the glass shattering, about the silence that had followed, about the moment when Sam Giancana had stood and Dean had understood he was about to die. He'd think about the choice he'd made, not the brave choice, not the smart choice, to be himself, to refuse to bend. If you had been standing there, would you have made the same choice? The king of cool. That's what they called him. But standing at that window, watching the sun creep over the desert mountains, Dean Martin felt the trembling return to his hands. The same trembling from that night. The same fear. It was still there. It would always be there. He'd just learned to stand with it. Dean Martin had chosen his death that night. He'd chosen to die as himself rather than survive as someone else. And Sam Giancana had seen it, had recognized it, had seen a man who understood the same truth. That reputation, once lost, could never be recovered. The champagne stain on the curtain stayed there for weeks. Eventually, they replaced the curtain entirely. But Dean had seen it, that faded stain, proof that the moment had been real. And sometimes, late at night after a show, Dean would stand on that stage alone and look at where the mark had been. He'd press his palm against the wall, feel the texture of the new fabric, remember the sound of crystal exploding, the silence that followed, the weight of Sam Giancana's stare. He finished his drink, turned away from the window, and in the silence of his suite, 3 a.m. in a city built on illusions, Dean Martin finally slept.